Rahim. Okay, question number 1. If x minus 1 over 3 equals k, so x minus 1 over 3 equals k, and then we're given the value of k, and then we're told k is 3. We're told k is 3. Then what is the value of x? See, this is an algebraic equation, and in this equation there are two variables, x and k. The reason we use variables in the equations is if you don't know the value of some number, you give it a variable name. So, for example, if you don't know somebody's name, you call them John Doe, for example, or Joe, or something like that. But if you know that person's name, you don't call them John Doe or Joe or whatever. You call them by their real name. So we use variables in algebra, of course, when we don't know the exact value of the number that we were talking about. So here there are two variables, x and k, and we don't know what they are. But if you did know what they were, we didn't be talking about x and k, we would be using those precise values. Well, here we're told that k is going to be 3, and then we're supposed to find what x is if k is 3. Easy peasy. Here we can just substitute, right? So x minus 1 over 3 equals 3, and then here we're supposed to solve for x. Now this is basics of solving equations now, right? So the way you solve equation like this, if you have x over 3, for example, equals 5, I'm simplifying this equation to illustrate a point. So if I give you x over 3 equals 5, the way you solve this equation is to multiply both sides by 3, right? So then those two cross, so the 3 goes into both of them one time, right? And then x is going to be equal to 15. So similarly, in this case, we're going to solve for x by multiplying both sides by 3. So but you have to remember this is a quantity, so you have to multiply this side by 3, and you have to multiply this side by 3, because whatever you do with one side of an equation, you have to do to the other side of the equation, right? So you multiply both sides by 3, so this 3 will be crossed off, they divide each other out, so then you get x minus 1 equals 9. And then if you add 1 to both sides, you get x is equal to 10. So that's pretty basic. If you have a hard time with this question, you're in trouble. But anyway, so that's question number 1. So solving for x, if you solving for x, we given the value k. Now question number 2 says, it gives you what I is I is equal to square root of negative 1. Now, of course, this is I is an imaginary number, and that's the definition of I. I is a square root of negative 1. And then it's asked, if I is a square root of negative 1, then what is this? In other words, simplify this thing, okay? The way you simplify, okay, 7 plus 3i, okay, that's that. And then you want to add that to negative 8 plus 9i. Now, before we do this is a pretty easy question. You have to understand a few things about these imaginary numbers, okay? So I is square root of negative 1. That's its definition. And then you have to know these basic things. So I squared is going to square this thing. I squared is negative 1. And then I cubed is I times I squared. That's going to be negative I, okay? And then finally, I to the 4th is going to use best friend 1. So that kind of you have to know. I squared negative 1. I squared is negative 1. I cubed is opposite of I, negative I, and I to the 4th is 1. Now this is something that you must have learned somewhere, and if you didn't learn that, this question is going to be pretty difficult for you. But anyway, this is the basic thing that you have to know. The second thing that you have to know about these imaginary numbers is that complex numbers are written like this: a plus bi. Okay, this is a complex number. This whole thing is a complex number. Okay. Now, complex numbers have two components. See, the first component over here is the real component, okay, as in real numbers, and the second component is here the imaginary component. So complex numbers have two components, the real component and the imaginary component. So this number over here, right here, this thing over here, that's a complex number. okay? And it has this 7, which is the real component, that's the real number part of it, and it has this 3i, which is the imaginary component. Why is it imaginary? Because of the I, because I is an imaginary number, square root of -1. So here you're adding two complex numbers. Each have a real component, which is over here like this, and they both have an imaginary component like that. So these are some basics that you have to know about complex numbers, right? All right. So when you're adding complex number or subtracting complex number, you add the real part and then you add the imaginary part. So in this case, you're going to add the 7 and -8. That's going to give you -1, and you add the imaginary part right here. That's 12i. So -1 plus 12i, and I think that's a over here. Okay, that's pretty easy, right? Okay, so these complex numbers questions can sometimes get very tricky, because adding and subtracting complex numbers is easy, but multiplying them can be kind of a little bit tricky. For example, if I have 2i times, let's take one of this, okay, 7 plus 3i, like this, okay? So if I were to multiply this, okay, then you be a good student and you distribute this like this, and then you get 14i, right? 14i, and then get 6i squared, right? But then you have the 6i squared, but I squared, if you know this, is -1. So this becomes 14i, that's -1, right? Like this. So then you have 14i minus 6. So, but then the proper way of writing these complex numbers is the mustahab way, the proper way, the preferred way is writing the real component first and then the imaginary component, like -6 plus 14i. So adding and subtracting complex numbers like this is pretty easy, but sometimes multiplying them can be a little tricky. You have to pay attention to all these little details, and if you're foiling them, if you were to multiply these two quantities, that'll be even trickier. You have to make sure you dot the i's, and cross the t's. Until next time, assalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Assalamu alaikum.